When do you have time on your calendar set aside to reflect, to assess, and to create? And I meet far too many leaders that say they don't. Somebody has to do that work. And so what I've encouraged leaders to do is to try it, to schedule 1 hour with yourself, just you, a meeting with me, not to do email, not to catch up on LinkedIn, for you to reflect, to assess, and to create. And I think if you'll dedicate that hour, you'll begin to get a sense for a couple things. One is the value that will bring to your life and leadership. And secondly, I would predict that many of you will be trying to find a way to add some additional time for margin. Most leaders I know that are really, really good would tell you that their highest contribution is the time they spend alone.
Welcome to Leadership, the podcast where leadership meets real-world insights. In each episode, you can eavesdrop on exclusive conversations with top thought leaders, best-selling authors, and experts in leadership, communication, relationships, culture, and everything else that shapes your effectiveness in the workplace and in your personal life. Leadership is here for you. Now, here's our host, himself a seasoned coach and best-selling author, Dr. Roger Dean Duncan.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Leadership. My guest for this episode is Mark Miller, best-selling author of more than a dozen books backed up by 4.5 decades of his own leadership practice. Mark and I are going to talk about the brand new 4th edition of his classic book, The Secret, What Great Leaders Know and Do, which he co-authored with Ken Blanchard, one of the true icons in the world of leadership. With more than 700,000 copies sold, The Secret has redefined leadership for a generation through the powerful serve model. Leadership wisdom is often presented as complex, layered, and difficult to master. But what if the essence of great leadership could be distilled into something remarkably simple, practical, and transformational? Well, it can, and Mark will explain how. Mark Miller, welcome to Leadership.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be with you. As you mentioned before we started recording, I think this is the 3rd time you've profiled one of our books, so it's great to reconnect.
You keep cranking out good stuff, and we'll keep talking.
All right. Sounds good.
Let's start with this. The original edition of The Secret came out 20 years ago and now has sold hundreds of thousands of copies across 3 editions. What in today's leadership landscape made you and Ken Blanchard decide the time had come for a 4th edition, and what specifically needed to change?
Well, we decided there'd be a 4th edition primarily because our publisher encouraged us to do so.
Okay.
They called and said the book is still selling, and which we're very thankful for. And we have theories on why it's selling, but nonetheless, the book continues to sell. And the publisher said, hey, have you got any new content? I mean, we didn't want to just do a smoke and mirrors and say, hey, we've got a new edition. And we said, we actually do. We've changed the 5th fundamental, which is the 2nd E in the model. And we changed that, and I can share the backstory as appropriate. And we said we would love to update this with this new enhanced perspective on the work we did over 20 years ago. And that's what led to this moment.
Well, I'm glad you did it. Now, you mentioned that while the truths in the book are timeless, you wanted to elaborate on the importance of a leader's heart in this edition. Why is the heart so critical in today's business climate?
Well, we would argue, Ken and I would argue, that it's always been critical. But those who might have read an earlier edition will recall that we mentioned the importance of the heart in that, even that very first edition.
Right.
But we said we're going to address that separately. And so I wrote a 2nd book called The Heart of Leadership. But it's always been critical. It's always been essential. It's always been extremely important. And that's why we updated the model, because what we discovered, and this is somewhat a blinding flash of the obvious, many people who had read The Secret or The Heart of Leadership had not read both books. And so they had a truncated view of leadership. the picture we drew in that first book, which we share again in this book, is an iceberg. About 10% of leadership is above the waterline, which are the skills, and about 90% is below the waterline, which represents the heart or character of the leader. And in that first book, we said we're not dealing with that here. And for decades, that has been a pressing issue for leaders around the world. And so this edition puts those concepts together.
Well, and I'm sure you've discovered that generations of readers. So, there are some people who haven't read the first edition yet, and now they're seeing the fourth edition. It kind of reminds me of my friend Stephen Covey's 7 Habits. I mean, that book came out in, I think, 1989, and there are at least a couple of generations now who are discovering it for the first time. Like, wow, this is great. Well, it's been around a while, as have the principles, and the principles in your book are timeless.
Yep, that's it. And so for anyone who's not read it, don't read the first edition, read the fourth edition.
Exactly. So the opening premise of the book is that the secret of great leadership is that great leaders serve. For people who hear that and think, well, that sounds soft. I thought leaders were supposed to be decisive and demanding. How do you reframe service so they see it as the more rigorous leadership stance, not the easiest?
Well, we reframe it and we reposition it throughout the book. And I know we're going to get into that content. The way that the best leaders serve is they do so strategically. And they engage in the 5 fundamentals that we outline in the book. I mean, it's great to serve in a non-strategic fashion, but buying people donuts and washing their car and walking their dog, it makes you a nice person to have around, but it doesn't make you a leader that people want to follow. And so the idea of serving is a little bit of the hook. I mean, that is the heart and intent, but you still have to embrace service in these fundamental ways so that it has the desired effect on the organization.
Well, the book is built around a parable. Why is storytelling such a powerful leadership tool?
Well, I can't claim to have come up with that idea. Of course, storytelling has been around. It's as old as recorded history. But because this was my first book 25 years ago, and I was going to co-author with Ken, he had sort of pioneered that format in the modern era. Right. And so I mimicked the style of his early books. I think why it's so powerful, it's multifaceted. We could probably talk for an hour about that. But let me summarize by saying that stories connect. When they're well told, they connect with the head and the heart. And there's research that says 63% of the people will remember a story and only 5% will remember a stat. So 5% of your audience is probably going to remember that stat, and others may recall some of the stories that we'll tell here today.
Well, the best speakers that we hear are good storytellers. Mm-hmm. So what misconceptions do leaders still have about servant leadership? We've heard about servant leadership for quite a while, and some people have misconceptions. What seem to be the most common ones?
Well, I'll tell you, there are a lot of misconceptions. I think, as you referenced earlier, there's a belief that servant leadership is soft, that it's not demanding, that it represents a compromise or a lowering of standards. And we would suggest that all of those myths are incorrect, that it's actually a very, very rigorous and demanding way for a leader to approach his or her role, and that the standards should be even higher, and the performance that results will exceed any traditional inferior forms of leadership. I mean, it is the gold standard.
Well, yes. And to be an effective servant leader, you need to be conscious about what you're doing. You don't just kind of float into it. You need to be very deliberate and strategic.
Absolutely. But let me give you just a little bit of the backstory. When we started this work, and some of your listeners may know that I spent almost 45 years working for Chick-fil-A.
Right.
And Chick-fil-A sponsored this work about 25 years ago because we needed to accelerate leadership development. I don't know what your viewers do when they have a problem to solve or an opportunity to seize, but historically, organizations assign a leader. And they tell them to put together the team and cobble together the resources and provide the leadership to either seize the opportunity or to rectify the problem. Well, a quarter of a century ago at Chick-fil-A, we had ample problems to solve and opportunities to seize. And we looked over our shoulder at our leadership bench and we said, uh-oh. We did not have a strong bench, and we began having conversations. I think this person can lead in the future. I hope this person will be ready in a few years. And you know what you do in the meantime, you either live with the problem, miss the opportunity, or you assign those to existing leaders.
Right.
And that's exactly what we did. But I'll give full credit to our executive committee. They knew that was a dead-end street. That is an unsustainable strategy because you'll just crush your existing leadership. And so they asked me to try and find out how to accelerate leadership development. And I put together a really smart team. And our very first conclusion is everybody was in favor of leadership, but we did not have a common working definition. In fact, we were all over the board on what great leadership looked like. And of course, you can immediately understand how that would impede our efforts to accelerate leadership development if we all defined it differently. And so we went to work trying to figure out what is it that the great leaders do and what have they always done. And that's what led to the work that we're about to unpack for the audience.
Well, you mentioned Chick-fil-A. I took my wife to Chick-fil-A recently, and when the server brought our food, I said, thank you. Most servers would say, no problem. This server said, my pleasure. And I pointed out to my wife, those two words give me a totally different feeling about being served than no problem. So little things matter.
They do.
Now, a key part of your book is a framework represented by the acronym SERVE. The S stands for See the Future. You say seeing the future is a responsibility that cannot be delegated. How can leaders find time to be visionary when they're often buried in daily operations?
All right. Well, again, a very thoughtful and insightful question, because I was asked on another podcast just recently what I believe the number one issues facing leaders globally would be at this point in history. And I said, it's all that stuff that's keeping them from doing the work of leadership. It's busyness, it's distraction, it's complexity, it's fear, fatigue, success. You pick whatever those impediments are, that is the leader's Achilles heel. And it may have been for a long, long time, but it has reached global proportions at this point. Now, you ask how they're supposed to see the future. I think as we think about these fundamentals, it's important to note that they're not intended to be a flow chart or a process diagram. It's not step 1, step 2, step 3, because what you're going to realize is that you should always be engaged with these 5 fundamentals. But this is first among equals. Leadership always begins with a picture of the future. And so here's what I would say to the leaders that are too busy to figure out where they're going. There's a real good chance they're not leading, because leadership is about helping people, teams, and organizations pursue a preferred future.
Right.
And if you don't make the time to figure out what is that preferred future, I mean, I'm not saying you're not working hard, but by definition, you need to be helping people move towards some objective, some destination, trying to accomplish something that's actually not true today. And so how do you make time? Wow. All right. A couple of thoughts. We wrote an entire book. So this is a whole different topic. We were concerned a few years ago with leadership effectiveness. We saw a lot of leaders who were struggling, really the essence of this very first question.
Sure.
And we outlined 4 strategies for them. But let me say this, leaders have got to own this issue. You have to spend enough time preparing for the future to ensure that you have one. Now, even as I say that, I probably need to put an asterisk on that. You're going to have a future, but if you're not thoughtful and you're not planful and you're not strategic, I can guarantee you it's not going to be the future you want.
Right.
And so one tactic that has proven very controversial, but I want to give the leader something they can actually take away from this episode for sure, It's been very controversial because it feels so counterintuitive, but it was one of the big takeaways from all of the research we did on leadership effectiveness. And I would say that you need to cultivate the discipline of margin. Now, a lot of people hear that. I've literally been told by leaders, I don't have time for a vacation. And I said, okay, hold on. I'm not talking about a vacation. I mean, I'm a fan of vacations. That's not what I'm talking about. I said, when do you have time on your calendar set aside to reflect, to assess, and to create? And I meet far too many leaders that say they don't. And I said, well, who's doing that work? Who's doing that work? Harvard completed a 12-year study of CEOs. Now, I'm not a CEO, and maybe many of your listeners aren't CEOs, but I know this. They're busy people. It's a demanding role. And Harvard said, let's figure out how these men and women use their time. Over a 12-year study, they found that they spend 28% of their time alone. Now, I'm not suggesting that's your answer, my answer, or the answer for your listeners. But someone said, what do you think they're doing when they're alone? I said, I think they're reflecting, they're assessing, and they're creating. Somebody has to do that work. And so what I've encouraged leaders to do is to try it, to schedule 1 hour. Now, I don't know if you need 2 hours or 20 minutes or 4 hours. I don't know. The bigger your problems, the bigger your challenges, the bigger your hopes and dreams, the more time you're going to need alone. But schedule 1 hour with yourself, just you, a meeting with me, not to do email, not to catch up on LinkedIn, for you to reflect, to assess, and to create. And I think if you'll dedicate that hour, you'll begin to get a sense for a couple things. One is the value that will bring to your life and leadership. And secondly, I would predict that many of you will be trying to find a way to add some additional time for margin.
Right.
Most leaders I know that are really, really good would tell you that their highest contribution is the time they spend alone.
Even if it's only 60 minutes for, as you say, for most leaders, that's 60 more minutes than they've been investing in that.
Right. And so, again, there are many other strategies, but because you said that, I'll mention one more. You need to clean up your calendar.
For sure.
I'd bet you a nickel that a significant percentage of what's on your calendar would not be missed if you didn't do it. Peter Drucker, who I'm not suggesting this is today's answer. Some of your listeners know that name. I would say the greatest management and leadership thinker of the last couple thousand years. Drucker said he had not met a knowledge worker, which translate that to leader, who could not eliminate 35% of what's on their calendar without any ill effect.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know if that's your number or not, but think about it. What if you only got a few hours back? Well, then you've got some time for margin.
Well, several years ago, I noticed that when I didn't get something done on my daily to-do list, I would push it to the next day. And then if I didn't get it done, I'd push it to the next day. And then it occurred to me, sometimes I'm a little slow, it occurred to me that if I postponed it 3 days, how important is it really to do it at all? And it was amazing how many things that sounded good, I didn't really need to do. And, the world went on.
Yeah. So leaders, we've got to find or make enough time to prepare for the future to ensure that we have one that's to our liking.
Right. And by the way, this formula, if you will, this framework applies to every relationship in our lives. What you just talked about is very good counsel for somebody who wants to have a better marriage, a better relationship with children. It applies to everything. Well, let's go to the first E in the SERVE framework. It stands for engage and develop others. How do you distinguish between engaging people's hands versus engaging their heads and hearts?
All right. You've been told this before. You ask really good questions. I'll try to be succinct in my response. To engage their hands, that's what you get when you hire them and you give them a check.
Right.
That's kind of a minimal table stakes. It's like you give them money and they give you their hands. They are, in essence, hired hands at that point. But we don't like that term because for every pair of hands you hire, you get a free brain. But you have to engage people in order to get their brain, in order to get their heart. And so this fundamental, it is about hiring and selection. We think that's the first part of engagement because it really does matter who you select, who you invite to join your team.
Sure.
But let's move beyond that. The real leadership challenge is not how engaged are they on day one, because most people would start a new job and you would expect them to be fully engaged. The real question and the challenge is how engaged are they in 6 months, 6 years, and beyond, like throughout their career.
Or during those times when nobody's watching.
Right. And engagement is the responsibility of leadership. And I've had some rather pointed and heated debates with leaders who don't want to own this. And they'll say, no, the engagement is the employee's thing. Well, we do the things or fail to do the things that lift and maintain an employee's engagement. We get them in the right role. We're sure that they're trained. We see that they're getting coaching and they're getting the resources they need to do their work. They're being affirmed. They're on and on and on and on. What we're really trying to do is create the conditions where people care. That's actually how we define engagement. We say it's how much people care about their work, how much they care about their coworkers, how much they care about their customers, and how much they care about their organization. And so when Gallup publishes their annual worker engagement survey, your listeners probably know that Gallup's been doing that survey for decades.
And the numbers are abominable.
They're crazy. And there's always somebody, like a leader that comes to mind, that believes that's an indictment on the global and the U.S. workforce. And I say, no, it's an indictment on leaders. The fact that the number is globally probably hovering around 15%, and in the U.S. it's only at about 30%. Think about the implications of trying to consistently perform at an elite level if only a third of your people or less actually care. It's hard enough when people do care. And so I just think we've got to do those things necessary to help people care.
Well, the R in the SERVE framework stands for Reinvent Continuously. How can a leader encourage a reinvention mindset in a team that's comfortable with the status quo?
Well, the leader sets the standard. I want to be careful that leaders don't forfeit their agency here.
Sure.
And we've got to continue to challenge our people. But I think in this reinvent space, it's going to take more than a challenge. Couple of things come to mind. One is the leader has to model the desired behavior. People always watch the leader.
Sure.
And are you the kind of leader that's learning and growing and reinventing yourself? The leader's got to has to point people to the systems and work processes that may need focus, because if you're not willing to change anything, you're most likely not going to get better results. Leaders understand that progress is always preceded by change.
Sure.
And non-leaders just don't get that. And so I guess the last thing I would say on this is you really have to affirm people who are willing to take the risk. We've done a lot of work on this over the years, and one of my team members reminded me something that Plato actually said: what is honored in a country is cultivated there. And I think the same is true as you talk about reinvention. If you honor people in an organization for reinventing continuously, those behaviors will be cultivated there.
Yeah, that quote is very powerful. It reminds me, and you've seen this, I'm sure, of how many organizations have beautiful values statements posted on the employee cafeteria wall, but that's where it ends. There's really no conscious, deliberate effort to reinforce and inculcate those values in the daily behaviors of everybody there.
Yeah, it's a tragedy because that actually undermines a leader's credibility.
Sure.
When you say something, but then you don't live like you believe it, I'll go back to what I said a moment ago. People always watch the leader.
Sure. You know, I hear what you say, but I'm watching what you do.
Your change initiative has the budget. The strategy looks solid, and everyone's nodding along in the meetings. But for some reason, it's going nowhere. Dr. Roger Dean Duncan knows why. After 40 years in the trenches with top business leaders, he knows that change fails when organizations lack the right foundations: trust, accountability, and real communication. Dr. Duncan's free 10-minute assessment shows you exactly where your organization stands. Answer a few straightforward questions that reveal your true change readiness level. Don't waste months discovering the hard way. Get your free assessment today at leadershop.net/change. Again, that's leadershop.net/change.
Well, the V in the SERVE framework stands for value, results, and relationships. Some leaders seem to feel that they have to choose between being results-oriented or people-oriented. Why is that a false dichotomy?
Well, I want to circle back. Let me tell you why that happens, and then I'll circle back to your question specifically. Most leaders, I don't have any hard data to support this. I want to be really clear, but this is based on my experience with this concept for 25 years, sharing it with leaders all over the world. I think most leaders, about 95%, have a natural bias. And they either show up more results-oriented or more relationship-oriented. So I think it's hard when you tell them to value both because they've got some internal wiring. Call it a personality trait or an orientation or a bias for one or the other. And so our counsel to leaders for decades now has been, we're not saying you should change. What we're saying is you need to compensate so that you can value both, because that's what the best leaders do. The false dichotomy is that people they think that if they focus on results, they'll get more results, which is, again, another counterintuitive finding of our work here is, no, the way you maximize results over time is to value both. And of course, if you over-index on the relationship side, you may think that would drive results. Well, it certainly doesn't drive results. You value both. Let me tell you a quick story. This was a chicken story. We periodically will, when I was there, they would take the field staff, and every 5 to 7 years, they would give people new assignments. So each field staff member worked with about 30 restaurants, and their role was to help those men and women who actually ran the restaurants be successful. And so we're 6 months into one of those reorgs, and somebody raised their hand and said, hey, we've been at this 6 months, and I've been talking about relationships and building relationships with my new operators for 6 months. When should I start talking about results? And the response was, you messed up 6 months ago. You should have said, we value results and relationships. I'm here to serve you so that we together can produce amazing results. And it's the only way to maximize results over time.
Well, the final E, and you've referred to this.
Well, we've changed it, right? We've changed it. That's the new part.
Tell us about that. Well, it stands for embody the values.
Well, it did. That's what we've changed. Yeah. It's embody a leader's heart. Mm-hmm. So let's go back to my opening comment about the iceberg.
Okay.
We had taken all of the heart stuff and it was in a separate book, and we wanted to bring it in so it would all be in one place. And so we think the fifth fundamental, which was always critical and it was always important, but it needed to be in this book, is embody a leader's heart. Because fundamentally, leaders see the world differently. Leaders are different. They're not better, but they have some attributes or some traits that enable them to become a leader people want to follow. Because here's the big idea. If your heart is not right, nobody cares about your skills.
Right.
And I think I can prove it to your audience. All you have to do is think about a man or woman that you've encountered during your career who had the skills of leadership that no one wanted to follow. Well, why not? If they had the skills, surely everyone would want to follow them. No, if your heart is not right, no one cares about your skills. And so I don't know that we'll get into it here today. I'll follow your lead, but we have identified some heart habits that we've outlined here, things that all of us as leaders can cultivate so that we can become that leader that people want to follow.
Well, let's talk about some of those habits. What do they look like? And on a daily basis, what would you see in a leader who was practicing these particular habits?
Okay, so the first I will mention is they hunger for wisdom. Is the best leaders are learners. They've always been learners, and they will always be learners. Now, I mean, you may have heard it said that leaders are readers. I think you got to put an asterisk on that, because I know some really great leaders who aren't readers, but they're learners.
Right.
So however a leader decides to fulfill their appetite to learn and grow,
Sure.
we've chosen to call it a hunger for wisdom. Another attribute is they expect the best. They're optimistic. It's not the rose-tinted glasses. They're always grounded in reality, but they believe in their agency and the power of their team and organization to create a preferred future. And they're quick to acknowledge if something is going to be hard or difficult or something doesn't work. So it's just an optimism. And you would see that and you would sense that. Nobody really wants to follow a pessimistic leader. Remember, the heart habits are what make you a leader people want to follow. So those are the type things. Again, we can go through the others if you want. I've got a few more. You want to run through them real quick?
Well, sure. Go ahead.
The third thing they do is they accept responsibility. The best leaders don't blame people. If things happen on your watch, you have to own it. Now, the flip side of that is these leaders that people want to follow, they're also quick to give praise.
Sure.
They're quick to give praise. Fourth is they respond with courage. Just about everything leaders do requires a little bit of courage. Sometimes it's a lot of courage.
Right.
But people want to follow courageous leaders. They're willing to make hard calls. They're willing to decide we're going to fund this and not fund that, and we're going to make this strategic decision. I'm going to have this hard conversation with this person. They're just courageous. And then fifth and finally, these leaders who embody a leader's heart, they think others first, which is a little, again, countercultural. That's not the way most of us are wired. But you can cultivate the ability to think others first. And the more you can do that, the more people are going to want to follow you.
When I think back of some of the really great leaders I've been exposed to over the years, I realize those are the habits they practiced. And embodied in all of it, what you just said, there's one practice that I've observed in some great leaders that I really admire. They are willing to learn from the people who report to them. They don't claim or even behave as though they believe that they are the smartest person in the room. Right. Because on a lot of issues, they are not the smartest person in the room.
That's right. That's right.
And when they exude that kind of, hey, we're all in this together kind of mindset, people are willing to speak up and put their ideas on the table. And then good things happen.
Yeah, that's that humility that I think is wound up in the hunger for wisdom, right? There's a humility, there's a teachable spirit, there's a vulnerability. Again, those are the things that make people want to follow you as a leader. Now, you still have to have the skills, and I'm quick to point out that it's not either or. Think about the heart habits actually turbocharge the skills.
Right.
You need skills, but then when your heart is right, people want to follow you. So it's a both and. You need the skills and the heart.
You certainly can't fake it either.
That's right.
Now, Mark, you suggest that leaders should ask themselves the question, am I a serving leader or a self-serving leader? What are the warning signs that a leader has become self-serving?
When a leader is too focused on his or her personal agenda. Now, I'm not suggesting a leader shouldn't have an agenda. They want to add value. They want to contribute. They want to leave a legacy. I mean, there are a lot of good things that can be on a leader's agenda, but those can't be the first thing that you think about. You really need to be focused on the people that you're serving and the team or organizational vision and mission that you're pursuing. It's when your agenda clouds your thinking, it will ultimately cloud your judgment.
Yes. Now, you've alluded to the iceberg 2 or 3 times. And you've said, and I believe rightly so, that it's a perfect picture of leadership, about 10% skills above the waterline and 90% character below. If that's true, and I believe it is, why does so much of our leadership training industry still concentrate on the 10%?
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe you can tell me. I think that there's a short-sightedness in our world, not necessarily just in leadership, but it certainly encompasses leadership. I mean, we live in a microwave world where we want everything really, really, really fast, right? And I got that, and I'm guilty of that. I want things fast. But a lot of the good stuff you don't get fast. And I think that urgency, I would even call it a hyper urgency, has led many organizations to move toward what they believe is most expedient. But again, it's not the way you maximize long-term results. It's not just about today. And I think that may be the primary culprit, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, one thought that comes to mind is that this is the kind of mental and even spiritual orientation that a person can come to when he or she starts to invest 60 minutes or more every day by him or herself, contemplating, really thinking deeply about what they can offer to their team.
Yeah. And let me say, 60 minutes a day may be the right answer. I was just advocating 60 minutes in a week, but that'd be great if somebody had that much time to focus on their leadership.
When I look back at some of the really great leaders I've worked with, and I've talked with them about this sort of thing, and they might use different language to describe it, but they would spend at least an hour a day alone focusing on this kind of thing.
Yeah. One more reason we don't see more focus there is I don't know that. Well, I would suggest, my opinion, we don't have near enough role models of the men and women who lead this way. And to make matters worse, there are a lot of leaders who would profess to be servant leaders who are doing an awful job.
Yeah.
And again, I think you referenced it earlier. That's been a fact in tarnishing the brand of what is in reality the highest form of leadership.
Right. Just because you say it doesn't make it so.
Exactly.
Now, Mark, you write that leaders should walk into every meeting with the intention of adding maximum value. Sometimes that means taking charge, sometimes taking out the trash. How does a leader rewire the instinct that says, I'm here to be in charge, into I'm here to add value?
Well, I think that is the billion-dollar question. I have often told the story about the first time I articulated what you just shared about walking into a room and trying to add value was I had just finished a 360-degree evaluation, and it was one of those highfalutin ones. It came with a consultant. It was going to be interesting. I mean, I was excited about it because I want to learn and grow, right? I want to hunger for wisdom. And so when I had the opportunity, I said, sign me up. And so the guy showed up to my office and he looked awful. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. I mean, he looked, I don't even know how to describe it. He looked unwell. I mean, he was in bad shape. So much so that I noticed. And I said, are you okay? And he said, it's about your results. And I went, what? I said, oh, well, have a seat. Have a seat. I said, what is it about my results that has you so troubled? And he said, and I quote, when you walk in a room, you're not trying to take charge. And I said, correct. Why does that bother you?
Yeah.
And he said, that's what leaders do. I said, well, in your paradigm, that's what leaders do. I said, that's not my paradigm. I said, I'm trying to figure out how I can add the most value in every situation, in every conversation, in every meeting. I'm trying to add the most value. And sometimes it is to take charge, and other times it's to take out the trash. And he left as confused as he was when he walked in because that was not his worldview. And I think that's ultimately a heart issue. I think that's ultimately a heart issue. Now, you could say it's a role clarity or role definition, but I think it's a heart issue.
Well, for sure. And what you just described reminds me of a time I used to do a lot of work in the nuclear power industry. I walked into a meeting at a nuclear station where I hadn't been before, didn't know any of the people. I walked into a leadership meeting, and there were like 20 people around this big table. And there was a lot of lively discussion, and this was their plan of the day meeting, outlining what's going to go on at the nuclear station all day. Very, very important safety issues being discussed, etc. I sat there for 30 minutes. I didn't know who the leader was until the end of the meeting. Somebody pointed him out. He wasn't at the head of the table. He wasn't talking a lot. He was asking questions. He didn't come across as, I think I'm the smartest person in the room. On some issues, he might have been. On others, he wasn't. That's why they had other people at the table, folks. Some leaders seem to forget that.
Well, somebody told me that if you're the smartest person in all the rooms that you're going in, you're not going in the right rooms.
Yeah, for sure. And I often tell people, if you got 12 people around a table and they agree on everything, you got the wrong 12 people. It's okay to disagree. Just, don't be disagreeable as you disagree, but, have these discussions. Now, speaking of assessments, you talked about 360 feedback. The 4th edition of your book includes a new self-assessment with 31 questions and a scoring system. What is the most common blind spot that you see when leaders take this assessment?
Well, I'm going to hedge my response just a little bit. The book is coming out in a few weeks.
Right.
So we've experimented with this assessment. We validated it, but we don't have a large enough data set for me to offer anything definitive. But I will say that we've done 2-3 other global studies, and I'm fearful that leaders are going to have an overinflated view of their own performance. What we find globally, and we've repeated this, we've not been looking for it. It's just anytime you ask leaders questions and you ask individual contributors question, there's a 30 to 40 point gap. 30 to 40 points. Now, some of that I'll chalk up to the optimism. I think you got to be, again, we've already talked about this, to have an optimistic spirit is a really good thing for a leader. However, we would suggest the best leaders are also grounded in reality. And if you're 30 to 40% off on any question that we ask, as opposed to the men and women doing the work, I would suggest that there are a lot of leaders who are not in touch.
Yeah, for sure.
So next time we talk, I'll give you some more specific attributes and fundamentals.
I look forward to that.
My general concern is that it's going to be inflated.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. Well, Mark, you and your co-author, Ken Blanchard, picked Nelson Mandela, Jimmy Carter, and Dr. Martin Luther King as serve exemplars. Are there any current leaders in business, government, sports, or the nonprofit world whom you'd add to that list today? And if so, who are they, and why would you put them on the list?
Yeah, I don't know that I've got anybody I would add today. Not to say they're not out there, but time is the best test.
That's true. And the people I just mentioned, they're no longer living. So we had plenty of time to observe them, didn't we?
Yeah. I think the rest of us are just striving and working towards the day that someone might say that we led well.
Well, we would hope so. We would hope to be eavesdropping on what people said at our memorial service. Well, Mark, when our Leadership listeners walk away from this conversation and commit to doing only one thing to embody the serve model, what should it be?
All right. So I'm going to ask everybody who's listening to try an experiment. And it's only going to take 24 hours. Look at your watch. What time is it right now? For the next 24 hours, I want you to try to add value to everyone you meet. Now, somebody is going to say, well, that's impossible. I say, well, time out. You need to listen very carefully to my challenge and this specific assignment. Try to add value. It's the trying that transforms. It's not your batting average. Because when I'm trying to add value to someone else, who am I thinking about? I'm thinking about them.
Sure.
I'm not thinking about me. Now, you may have to pause for a minute and get your phone out and start typing, or get a napkin and start writing down some ways that you can add value. I literally had a CEO ask me one day, it was a little bit troublesome. They wanted to know, how do we add value to people? I went, well, okay, I would hope that you wouldn't have to ask that, but maybe we've just not thought enough about it. But when you can encourage someone, when you can resource someone, when you can coach someone, when you can compliment someone, I mean, you can make a list, of all these different ways. If you're a person of faith, you can offer a silent prayer on their behalf. If you'll say, I'm going to try to add value to every person I encounter for 24 hours, my bet is that you'll want to try it another day, and you want to try it another day, because it will change you. It will change your heart. It will change your orientation. It'll change your impact in every room you enter for the rest of your life.
Those are words that came to my mind. It'll change your heart, it'll change your orientation, and it will change your impact. There's no doubt about it. Well, Mark Miller, thank you so much for joining us on Leadership. Leadership is often measured in outcomes, but as we just explored, its true power lies in intention, consistency, and the willingness to serve. The secret reminds us that great leadership isn't reserved for a select few. It's accessible to anyone willing to align vision with action and put people at the center of their work. As you reflect on this conversation, consider this. Are you leading in a way that others would choose to follow? Because in the end, the legacy of leadership isn't what we achieve alone. It's what we enable others to become. Be sure to leave a review of our podcast. Even a single sentence fuels the algorithms that promote the great content that the Leadership podcast provides. And for free resources to help you in your leadership journey, go to leadership.net. That's leadership.net. Thanks again for joining us. Until next time, stay safe, be happy, and spread good cheer wherever you go. For Leadership, I'm Roger Dean Duncan.